Hello everybody, it's me, the friendly Englishman, back with the final part of the first book in the Grey Seer series by C.L. Werner. Just to say a tremendous heartfelt thank you to all of you that have supported me throughout this book series. I think it's one of the best series I've had on YouTube. Long may the success continue, and I will definitely improve on the next book I am reading, which will be, at time of recording, Skaven, Slayer, Gotrek, and Phoenix. Right, anyway, that's enough YouTubery. Let's dive on in. This is Chapter 12, The Triumph of Thankwall. The abandoned townhouse on the Reichhof-Parkstrasse was as still as a crypt when 20 armed men and dwarfs burst through its doors. From front and back, the men rushed through the dusty rooms, swords and pistols at the ready. Each man's brow dripped with a sweat of fear, knowing too well the hideous enemy they expected to find. As they surged into each empty room, their fear only increased. If the Ratkin had not confronted them already, it could only be because they were waiting for the intruders to stumble into some kind of devious trap. Theodore Bayer led the group that had smashed its way through the entranceway at the front of the townhouse. Bayer could feel the hairs standing on the back of his neck as he crept through the silent rooms. He had heard the stories about the townhouse and its last tenant, tales of vampirism and worse horrors. The watch sergeant allowed himself a grim chuckle. Besides his fear of the restless dead, confronting a mob of verminous underfolk would almost seem tame by comparison. Almost. Theodore kept his pistol aimed, turning it with the lantern in his free hand. The instant his light showed something monstrous, it would get a bullet through its skull. He only hoped the men with him were as ready for action. Most of them he knew only casually, some of them not at all. Being a vessel of Jeremiah Scrivener was not the sort of thing that drew men together for socializing in their off hours. Of course, the very fact that they did serve the wizard spoke of their capability. Scrivener was not one to make time for charity cases. Those who bore his token were men with something to offer him, some skill useful to the wizard's interests. Entering the parlour, Theodore's lantern revealed a shambles of piled furniture and torn tapestries. The sickly stink of spilled perfume assailed the watchman's senses. He heard Armando, the Tillian duelist, cough violently behind him, clenching a rag to his face against the smell. Theodore controlled his own repugnance, sweeping the lantern across the room. A grey shape appeared in front of him. Before he could tug the trigger of his pistol, a steely grip knocked his hand aside. "They have gone," the chill voice of Jeremiah Scrivener told him. The wizard reached to Theodore's lantern, throwing open the metal shutters on its sides. The sudden light threw the parlour into sharp relief. Theodore's initial impression of cluster and ruin was justified. Someone had ransacked the entire townhouse to create a gaudy impression of a throne room, like a child playing king. Sounds from the hallway beyond the parlour brought Theodore and the men with him turning from their cursory inspection of the room. Certain that the Ratkin had sprung their trap, each man tensed, weapons at the ready. Sighs of relief spread across the parlour. The sounds had come from the men who had come back from the house. Theodore gave a grudging nod of respect to Simo Valkoneth. "Report," the hissed whisper of Scrivener commanded the professional killer. "Nothing," Valkoneth answered. Nothing alive, at least. There are rooms that look like an orc warband slept in them. Most of those smell like a Horus boudoir. But no trace of what did the damage. No trash, no fur, no scat. They clean up after themselves, observed one of the fighters with Theodore. The speaker was a squat, broad-shouldered dwarf, his frosty beard tied into elaborate braids that fell almost to his knees. His dark eyes twinkled like chips of ore from his wrinkled face, almost matching the mail shirt and steel helm he wore. Grimbold Silverbeard did not speak only of Viconan's report. He pointed a stubby finger at the floor. Amid the debris of tattered finery, patches of the dusty floor had been scrubbed so fiercely that the tiles were little more than layers of scratches. Skaven blood isn't easy to get back. Back in Zufbar, if I got it on anything that wasn't metal, we usually burned it. Damn bad choice to make between carrying that stink around and cutting your beard. Trying to hide the fact that they were here, Theodore wondered. But why drench the place in perfume? You can smell it from across the street. Because it isn't men they are afraid will find their trail, Scrivener said. The Repmen are their own worst enemies. This was done to hide their scent from their own kind. The Skaven who possess the stone are afraid they will be discovered by enemies from their own ranks. Perhaps that fear has gripped them enough that they will not be expecting other enemies to come after them. Magister! It was Grimbold who called out, his voice betraying an excitement his people seldom allowed themselves to display. Scrivener swung around at the dwarf's call, staring over his shoulder as the dwarf displayed what he had found. It was a scrap of torn parchment, hoary with age. I found it poking out from under the chest, Grimbold explained. It's a chart. One of the blueprints of the Grey Dwarfs who helped construct the city's infrastructure. This one. His thick thumb tapped a set of Khazalid runes drawn at the top of the parchment. It's something called the Dunkel. That's all that's left. The Dunkel Wasserkleinmeer, Scrivener finished for the dwarf. An old name. Now it is known as the Kaiserschwalbe. Grimbold's eyes went wide with horror. The reservoir? The filthy ratkin mean to poison the reservoir? We can't let them, Johann swore, pushing his way through the other men in Viconan's group. They'll poison hundreds, thousands, if they put that filth into the water. The smuggler clenched his fists in fury, imagining the magnitude of suffering. Entire households stricken with the same slow corruption that had beset his brother. Men, women and children, it would be wholesale slaughter, such as even a Kurgan warlord would balk at. Scrivener gave Johann a grim nod, then looked to Grimbold once more. You will lead us to the reservoir. I maintained the Imperial sewers long enough to know every way into the place, Grimbold said. But the Ratkin are fair diggers. They might have made their own way. We'll reach the reservoir, but without knowing what route they are using, I can't say if we'll beat them or simply meet them. Then the surest course is to follow their trail, the wizard stated. He removed a vial from the folds of his cloak. Johann had never seen such a vibrant purple elixir as that which sloshed against the clouded glass of the vial, but he recognized the dove of the Shalian temple on the wax seal that closed its top. Sorry guys, that should be dove. He recognized the dove of the Shalian temple on the wax seal that closed its top. Stay here, Scrivener commanded, and do not move, whatever you see. His cloak swept around him as he stalked from the parlour and through the broken wall that led into the kitchen. Tense moments passed Then the men in the parlour heard a grisly sound of laboured breathing and grinding bone. Despite the wizard's warning, the watchers drew back from the grotesque shape that crawled through the wreckage. It was an immense, rat-like thing, not an inch of its body unmarked by violence. Broken bones ground together as the beast pulled itself across the floor, dragging its useless hind limbs after it. The thing gave them no notice as it crossed the parlour, leaving a bloody trail after it. The drooling, slobbering horror vanished into the gloom of the study. The men in the parlour could hear wood splintering as the monster attacked the wall with its fangs, gnawing at the concealed entrance to the basement. But the map was not the only thing the Skaven left behind. The wizard's whispered words startled men who had been fixated upon the rat beast. Once more, their cloaked master stood among them. Johann noticed that the vial in Scrivener's hand was now empty. The tears of Shalia allowed Abomination a few more hours. We must trust that they are enough. The Skaven learned well from our smuggler friends, Scrivener added, gesturing to the black paste none of Thanquol's minions had dared clean from the parlour. They have mixed their vile poison with wine to hide its smell, well enough to hide from their own kind and my familiars. There was a loud snapping noise as the rat beast gnawed its way past the secret panel. Scrivener's eyes burned in the darkness as the sound carried into the parlour. But there's one knows they can't trick anyone, he said, stalking after the rat beast as it disappeared through the hole it had made. Scrivener's servants fought down their own fears and followed after their mysterious master. Right now, I bet you wish Volk had settled your mob down in the sewers, Theodore told Johann as they waited their turn to descend into the basement. Johann shook his head. I may die in a sewer yet, he told the watchman, but this time at least I'll do it for more than a few barrels of contraband. Scratch Scarpaw scrambled up the slime-slick sewer wall, clinging to the dripping surface of an archway. As one of the skilled assassins of Clan Eshin, Lord Skrolk had sent him ahead to scout the way for the Plague Lord's retinue. Despite Cratch's assurances and oaths of loyalty and service, Skrolk was being wary of treachery from Thanquol's former apprentice. Among the Skaven, there was no such concept of being overcautious. Scarpaw, being near the end of his usefulness to Skrolk, was not only the most capable of spotting any traps the Grey Seer might have set, but also the most expendable if he fell afoul of one. The assassin's claws found tiny gaps between the bricks to maintain his hold. His scaly tail coiled about one of his cruelly serrated swords. Scarpaw's eyes glittered in the darkness, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Beneath the fog of human waste, he smelled a familiar scent. The odour of fresh blood was strong as he heard something large sloshing through the muck. Scarpaw tensed as a new scent reached him, the reek of the rat beast that had routed Thanquol's minions during their expedition into the forgotten burrows of Clan Maul. He held his breath as the huge monster dragged itself through the scum of the canal, its mangled body little more than an open wound. Any moment might see the beast's finish. Scavenging instincts reared up from the depths of Scarpaw's psyche, urging him to leap upon the dying monster, but reason subdued the impulse. There were other sounds now, sounds of many feet trudging through the sludge and scum. Scarpaw pressed himself ever closer to the wall, vanishing into the shadow of the vaulted ceiling. He stifled his breathing, willed his heartbeat to an infrequent murmur. Like a verminous gargoyle, he became as lifeless as the stone around him, only his glittering eyes betraying his presence. Men emerged from the darkness. Scarpaw knew enough of the ways of men to recognize that these presented a motley gang. Finery mixed with the rags of the slums, their soft sense of refinement mixed with the hard smells of the lower classes. At their front, Scarpaw saw a grey-bearded dwarf leading the way, a light glowing from the peak of his helm as he followed the dying rat beast. Just behind the dwarf, however, was a figure that sent a thrill of fear racing through Scarpaw's pulse. A hooded man, cloaked in grey and with the chill of sorcery about his smell. It could only be the wizard thing that had fought Thanquol for possession of the Wormstone. He had survived his battle with the Grey Seer and was once more on the trail of his adversary and his prize. Somehow, in some way, the wizard thing was letting the rat beast lead him to Thanquol. Scarpaw lingered in the shadow of the archway for many minutes, allowing the steps and scent of the men to fade into the distance. After what Cratch had told Skrulk about the wizard thing, the assassin wanted to take no chance of the human discovering his presence. Even his killer's heart preferred not to pit itself against magic and sorcery. The memory of Thanquol's spell of madness was still too fresh. Certain he was undiscovered, Scarpaw dropped down from his sanctuary, sliding along the slimy brickwork to the putrid surface of the canal. At first, with caution, and then with speed, the assassin raced down the black maze of sewers, darting down side passages and around cross tunnels. The Ratman's winding route seemed a confusion of turns, but he was not relying upon memory to bring him back to his gruesome master. Scarpaw used the rotten smell of the plague monks to lead him through the sewer, a smell even the dull senses of a human would find hard to mistake. Soon, the assassin stood in the tunnels where Lord Skrulk's festering followers were gathered, impatiently awaiting their scout's report. The Plague Lord himself shuffled forward as Scarpaw came upon the clustered vermin. Skrulk's boil-strewn face scowled at the assassin, the fumes rising from his censer staff matching the smouldering temper in his blemished eyes. "There will be no more medicine until you clear the path," Skrulk warned the assassin, his voice bubbling with menace. "If the Wormstone escapes me, you will wish I had let the pox do its work." Scarpaw prostrated himself before the ghastly Plague Lord, taking the decayed hem of his filthy robe and rubbing it across his nose in a show of abasement. "Horrific one," he whimpered. "Others seek the traitor." He pointed to where Cratch stood among the plague monks, the adept now garbed in the same rotten green robes. "The wizard thing still seeks Thanquol. I have seen it and its underlings walking through the scat stream. They were following the great rat beast from Clambol. They were hunting the Wormstone." Cratch scrambled from the mass of plague monks, grovelling at the feet of Lord Skrulk. He kissed the Plague Lord's decaying tail, rubbed his forehead against the monk's leprous foot, anything to make his show of abasement and devotion more convincing than that of the assassin. "Terrible bringer of suffering," Cratch wheezed. "Your humble servant did not know the wizard thing still lived. I did not know." Lord Skrulk's laugh was an obscene gurgle, like heart blood slopping from a wound. "We will follow the wizard thing," he croaked. But if the wizard thing finds Banquo first, Cratch started to protest. Skrulk seized the cringing adept in his paw. Do you think Thanquol will simply hand the wormstone to the human? The plague lord growled. Cratch's tongue lolled from his mouth as he felt the claw around his throat tighten. We will let the human find the traitor first. They will fight over the wormstone. Then Clan Pestilence will destroy the exhausted victor and recover what belongs to us. Lord Skrulk tossed Cratch aside like a piece of refuse. The adept rubbed his injured throat, sickened to find that one of Skrulk's decayed claws had broken off in his skin. The wormstone will be mine, Skrulk chittered. Then shall all the Under-Empire tremble once more before the might of Clan Pestilence and the true face of the Horned One. Grey Seer Thanquol lashed his tail in annoyance as he stepped onto the stone ledge overlooking the enormous Kaiserschwalbe. Once, many centuries ago, it had been a natural cavern, an underground lake fed by springs and subterranean streams. Under the patronage of Altdorf princes and emperors, however, dwarf artisans and engineers had transformed the cavern into a mammoth edifice of marble and granite. Huge pillars rose from the depths of the lake, their fluted columns reaching up like fingers of drowned giants until they merged with the tiled ceiling of the cavern. The elaborate frescoes shimmering with the reflection of the water beneath them. Massive pumps of steel and bronze hugged the columns, operating upon an ingenious system of pressure valves. The pumps employed the volume of the reservoir itself to send water up into the city above. Everywhere, from the dam-like restraining wall of the reservoir to the stone walkways that crisscrossed over the aquifer, elegant sculptures and magnificent bas-reliefs lent the place a majesty that made the Grey Seer's heart seethe with contemptuous envy. That men would squander such time and effort into something they could hardly expect of their own kind was beyond Thanquol's ability to understand. Of what use was grandeur if it was not used to inspire fear and awe in subordinates? The Grey Seer was still chewing over that quandary when his sharp eyes noticed movement on the cavern floor. Restrained by the dam, there was a section of the old cavern that had been left relatively dry except for a deep channel that allowed the reservoir's excess to escape back into the dark of the underworld. It was this stream that provided much of Altdorf's water. The decadent council of the city, far too miserly to pay tolls to Clan Sleekit for use of regular river water. Sight of the stream made a fierce smile grow on Thanquol's face. Final confirmation that his plot to poison the man-things of Altdorf would also spell doom for his enemies in Under Altdorf. Thanquol shook his head, his eyes narrowing as he again focused upon the creatures moving around the reservoir. A work crew of humans, performing some manner of maintenance upon the dam, scrambling up wooden scaffolds with what a Skaven could describe as only the most wretched clumsiness. One of the humans gave a shout, a trembling hand pointing up at Thanquol. The other humans turned, tools dropping from their hands, jaws dropping open in shocked silence. The Grey Seer's tail lashed in annoyance again. Glaring at the stupid animals, awestruck by his magnificence and their own superstitious terror. It was almost insulting that these pathetic dregs should be the final obstacle between himself and ultimate glory. "Scrim," Thanquol snarled. Have your slinking thief rats kill those animals? It would be abuse of his powers. Far beneath, sorry, I read that in his voice. It would be an abuse of his powers and far beneath his dignity to partake in the slaughter of such a sorry mob. Thankwall would leave that to base creatures like Scrim and his sneaks. Besides, even the most wretched enemy sometimes got lucky. Thankwall watched the clan school ratmen scamper down from the ledge, leaping onto the scaffolds and gantries with ape-like agility. The men closest to the ledge were already dead before their comrades started to run. Thankwall laughed as he watched Scrim's sneaks do their bloody work. Laughter turned to a snarl of anger as he heard the sharp crack of a warplock pistol. A worker pitched and fell, smashing against the side of the dam before bouncing to the cavern floor hundreds of feet below. Another pistol barked in the darkness, this time blasting a walker off a stone causeway and into the reservoir itself. The wounded man thrashed in the water, desperately trying to keep his mangled frame afloat. The warlock engineer who had shot him rushed to the edge of the causeway directly above him and hurriedly reloaded his pistol, snickering at his flailing victim all the while. Thankwall stamped his feet, his fur bristling, his fangs grinding together. What were the fools doing? He hadn't sent Burnfang's pack into the fray. He wasn't about to risk what they were carrying by fighting a miserable lot of defenseless humans. Grey Seer Thankwall rounded on Viscit Burnfang. He wanted to crack his staff against the idiot's snout, but he was too far away. Instead, Thankwall contented himself with a very vicious string of obscenities and staff rattling. "Fool meat! Flea-brained mouse-fondler! Did I squeak say send your tinker rats into battle? If they lose one bottle of wormstone..." Burnfang grinned at Thankwall, a savage, fang-ridden smile that spread from cheek pouch to cheek pouch. "They won't lose the wormstone," Burnfang snapped. "But you will, priest dolt." Before Thankwall could even blink, Burnfang whipped his own pistol from his belt, aiming the muzzle between the Grey Seer's eyes. A deep growl and a heavy footfall told of Bone Ripper's reaction to this sudden threat against his master. Burnfang didn't even glance at the rat ogre. "Call him off, Thankwall," he snarled. "He couldn't reach me before this trigger exploded into your skull like an egg." Thankwall turned his head, noticing for the first time that he was alone upon the ledge with Burnfang. That was why he had sent his minions down to help Scrim. The warlock engineer wanted no witnesses to his treachery. That thought puzzled Thankwall and occupied his thoughts even as he snapped commands to Bone Ripper. The rat ogre suddenly sank to his haunches, head lowered like that of a scolded child. Bone Ripper could not understand why his master had called him back, his simple mind unable to reconcile the contradiction between the threat in Burnfang's scent and Thankwall's command to sit and stay away from the warlock engineer. The confusion made him rock from side to side, his instinct to obey the Grey Seer warring with his instinct to tear apart his master's enemies. "What is your scheme, Burnfang?" Thankwall snarled. "If you think the council in Under Altdorf will reward you for bringing me to them, I swear the Lords of Decay will reward you much, much more." "I know they will," Burnfang hissed through his fang-ridden grin. He slapped his chest with his paw. "Skaven Blight does not care about you, Grey Seer. It is the wormstone they want. They shall have it. but it will be Master Viscit Burnfang who presents it to the Council of 13, not Great Seer Thankwald. Burnfang's paw reached to his belt, removing a glass orb from a leather bag. It resembled the gas bombs employed by Clan Scryer, but its contents were a murky liquid. Thankwald instinctively took a step back as he saw Burnfang's bomb and caught the scent of its contents. He flailed at the lip of the ledge, nearly pitching to the floor below. Instead, Thankwald threw himself forwards, landing in a sprawl before Burnfang's feet. The Warlock Engineer started to laugh at the Grey Seer's antics, but the roar of Bone Ripper stifled any amusement Burnfang felt. The Warlock Engineer fired his pistol into the charging brute, blasting a fist-sized chunk of flesh from his side. The rat ogre gave a snarl of pain, but kept coming, storming after Burnfang like a hate-maddened juggernaut. Burnfang flung the spent weapon foot into the charging rat ogre's face, but succeeded only in cracking one of the monster's fangs. The Warlock Engineer leapt away as Bone Ripper's thick arms reached for him, shrieking in fright. Narrowly, he missed hurtling to the floor hundreds of feet below, landing instead on a scaffold. The wooden structure swayed and groaned beneath the abrupt addition of Burnfang's weight. Bone Ripper started after the Warlock Engineer, several ropes snapping as he took a step onto the scaffold. A shrill command from Thankwald called his bodyguard back. Still glaring at Burnfang, the rat ogre lurched back onto the ledge. The Grey Seer joined him, watching as the treacherous Warlock Engineer scrambled to the next scaffold, putting a further 20 feet between himself and his enemies. "An impasse, grey fool," Burnfang snarled. "I don't dare come after you while you have your monster, and you don't dare come for me while I hold this." Again, the Warlock Engineer brandished the dusty globe of glass. Even in the extremes of his terrified retreat, he had enough sense to keep a firm grip on the deadly object. Thankwald did not respond to Burnfang's baiting. Too late did the Warlock Engineer observe the green glow in the depths of the Grey Seer's eyes. Too late did he see Thankwald's paw stretch out, his fingers splayed wide apart. With a savage gesture, Thankwald closed his fingers into a fist. In sympathy with the Grey Seer's motion, without any conscious thought from their owner, Burnfang's fingers did likewise. Viscit Burnfang screamed as the glass globe shattered beneath the tightening pressure of his rebellious hand. Howls of terror became shrieks of agony as the lethal contents of the orb saturated his flesh and seeped into his fur. The Warlock Engineer pulled widely at his poisoned body, trying to claw the sorcerer's venom away. Almost instantly, fur began to drip off his skin. Fat green worms began to erupt from his flesh. When, at last, in a fit of panic and suffering, Burnfang threw himself into the cavern, his decaying body was little more than a mass of squirming filth. "So suffer all who defy the destiny of Thankwald," the Grey Seer snarled as he watched Burnfang's writhing carcass burst upon the cavern floor. Thankwald looked up to find the eyes of Skull Sneaks and the remaining Warlock Engineers fixed upon him. Burnfang's treachery had drawn an audience after all. He glowered back at the frightened Skaven, straightening into his most imperious posture. "So end all, traitors," he growled, slamming the butt of his staff against the ledge. The watching Skaven bowed and grovelled, spurting the musk of fear. Thanquol snickered, relishing their terrified devotion. Bowripper's low growl drew the Grey Seer away from the adulation of his minions. It was on Thanquol's tongue to chastise the rat ogre, but movement at the mouth of the tunnel opened onto the ledge made him hesitate. The Grey Seer's eyes narrowed as he saw something big crawl into the fitful light of the reservoir cavern. He recoiled as he saw the rat beast pull itself into the chamber, the monster's mangled body leaving a bloody slick behind it. That anything should survive the punishment the rat beast had suffered was incredible to the Grey Seer. Disturbing memories of the necromancer Vorgon of Prague and his lifeless creations sent a pulse of terror rushing through Thanquol's glands. "Bone Ripper!" he shouted at his hulking bodyguard. "Kill, kill! Kill, kill!" Thanquol gestured frantically at the rat beast with his staff. Bone Ripper smacked one meaty fist into another and rushed towards the rat beast. The monster caught the rat ogre's scent, pushing itself awkwardly from the floor with its forepaws. It snarled at the charging rat ogre, its own blood slobbering from its broken jaw. Bone Ripper swung at the creature with his armoured third arm, but the rat beast dropped beneath the blow, crashing lifelessly at the rat ogre's feet. Thanquol stirred incredulously as Bone Ripper stubbornly poked and prodded the dead hulk, vainly trying to get the lifeless beast to fight him. Whatever monstrous strength had allowed the rat beast to chase after him, it had abandoned the thing at the very moment when it had last gained upon its quarry. Thanquol's chittering laughter echoed across the reservoir as he considered the cruel irony of the dumb brute's fate. Cold, mocking laughter, like the whisper of an enormous serpent, stifled Thanquol's own. The Grey Seer drew a pinch of warped snuff from the rat skull box as he backed away, retreating onto the stone causeway. He knew that laughter. A dark figure slowly manifested upon the ledge, seemingly bleeding into substance from thin air. Shadows swirled and crawled about the cloaked wizard, his grey eyes boring into the beady orbs of Thanquol. The Grey Seer trembled with outrage more than fear. The reservoir was here, beneath his very feet. All he had to do was pour the warmstone into the water, and all his enemies, human and Skaven, were doomed to die in excruciating pain. Skaven blight would herald him the greatest seer since Nordun recovered the Black Ark. Thanquol snarled at the sinister wizard. One claw closed about a protective talisman. He thrust his staff towards Jeremiah's Scrivener. Thanquol snickered as he saw clouds of darkness leap from Scrivener's pointing hands. He felt the talisman in his paw crumble into powder as it absorbed the wizard's spell, drawing the baleful energies into itself to protect its wearer. The head of his staff erupted into a scintillating sphere of phosphorescence. Like some diseased echo of an aurora, Thanquol roared as he flung the dazzling light at the Shadowmancer. A blanket of green luminescence engulfed the ledge as Thanquol's spell struck. Thanquol had seen how capably Scrivener could protect himself. This time, the Grey Seer chose to attack not the man, but everything around him. What power, he wondered, could a Shadowmancer wield if there were no shadows to command? The grey seer snickered as he saw Scrivener staggering in the spectral glow. Again, Thanquol's shrill voice cried out, his clawed finger stabbing at the reeling wizard. "Bone Ripper!" the grey seer cried. "Kill, kill! Kill, kill!" That was the end of Chapter 12. Chapter 13, the final chapter, War of the Rats. Bellowing like a blood-mad bull, Bone Ripper thundered towards the staggering wizard, his shoulder lowered to impale Scrivener upon his spiked armour. Still stunned by Thanquol's blinding sorcery, the Magister was oblivious to his peril. Others were not. From the mouth of the tunnel, a voice cried out a hasty command. It was Bone Ripper who staggered as a volley of shots rang out and his leathery hide tore beneath the impact of bullets. The rat ogre howled in pain, dropping onto 5 paws and scrambling away from the fusillade, blood streaming from his wounds. A cheer went up from Scrivener's men as they saw the monster flee. "Press the attack!" Theodore Bayer cried out. "Keep the rat men from the reservoir!" Thanquol heard the watchman shout, grinding his fangs as he saw the men rush across the ledge. Lightning crackled about the metal head of his staff. Snarling, the grey seer sent a bolt of withering energy to strike down the would-be hero. Sizzling warp energy crackled through the air like a thin finger of glowing death. Thanquol's beady eyes gleamed as he watched the corrupt power crash down upon the human. Even as the warp lightning struck at the man, however, Theodore's body was engulfed in darkness, fading, blinking into the shadows. When the grey seer's attack landed, all its fury accomplished was to sear the stones where the man had stood. Thanquol growled in frustration, glaring at the cloaked wizard. Jeremiah Scrivener glared back at him. Recovered from the grey seer's blinding spell, now it was the wizard's turn to frustrate the rat mage's sorcery. Thanquol squealed, diving behind the nearest of the marble columns as Scrivener gestured at the Skaven with his black-coated hand. Knives of shadow-given substance slashed through the cavern, slicing into the column and tearing through the ancient dwarf-built pump bolted to its side. Streams of water erupted from the pitted metal, spraying in every direction. Thanquol snarled from behind his refuge, glaring at his cowering minions. "Scrim!" the grey seer raged. "You and your thief rats! Kill the man-things!" The clan school's spy hesitated, but a second glance at Thanquol's glowing eyes and snarling face decided him. The crook-backed old Skaven snapped orders to his sneaks. The ratmen surged forwards, scrambling along the sides and bottoms of the scaffolds and gantries to frustrate the fire of the humans rushing to oppose them. One Skaven lost his grip, scrabbling desperately at the carved face of the dam before plummeting into the cavern. The rest kept scurrying onwards, swiftly closing the distance between themselves and the men rushing onto the causeways. "Not you, idiot meat!" Thanquol howled in disgust. He watched in dismay as the surviving Warlock engineers scurried forward to support Scrim's sneaks once more. One of the clan Scryer engineers heard the grey seer's roar, giving Thanquol a puzzled look. "You are carrying wormstone!" the grey seer shrieked. The Ratman gave an embarrassed nod. Thanquol's blood was already boiling, and the human gesture made him lose all control. He sent a bolt of warp lightning scorching through the Warlock engineer, turning him into a tiny torch as he bounced down the layers of scaffolding and into the cavern. Thanquol slapped his forehead at his own stupid loss of control, grinding his teeth at yet another human gesture. He'd been among the men rats of Under Altdorf too long. He was picking up their decadent habits. Certainly, he had been infected by their stupidity. If he had to make an example of someone, an underling carrying Wormstone was not the one to choose. There was at least one benefit from his tantrum, however. He'd gained the attention of the other Warlock engineers. Thanquol glowered at the masked ratmen. "Any of you full meat-carrying Wormstone?" he growled, lashing his tail angrily as he was answered with more nods. "Forget the humans," he snarled. "You scurry your tails up to me." He pointed at the far end of the dam, where another set of scaffolding would allow the Skaven to climb up to the level of the causeway and the reservoir. 3 Warlock engineers started off, scrambling and leaping from platform to platform. The few engineers who were the survivors from the work crew fled at their approach, offering the Skaven not even the slightest opposition. Thanquol peered from behind the column, grinning as he saw Scrim Nortail's sneaks pounce upon the wizard's allies. Men might be stronger than Skaven, but they were laughably slow. With their terror of Thanquol's power to goad them onwards, Scrim's vermin would make short work of the humans. Just as Thanquol was deciding the fight was over before it began, he saw one of the sneaks swatted from the scaffolding by a wave of shadow that billowed and clung to him like fog. The Grey Seer didn't give any thought to the wretch's shriek as he fell, instead concentrating upon the real problem. The wizard was the flea in the fur of his plan. His magic could tip the balance against him. Unfortunately, he wasn't sure there was any way to remove his threat without risking his own hide in the process. The sound of water lapping against the column drew Thanquol's attention. He grinned evilly as he saw Bone Ripper trying to climb up from the lake and join his master on the causeway. His beady eyes turned back to the cloaked wizard. Scrivener was on one of the other causeways, supporting his underlings with his shadow magic. The Grey Seer hissed a command to Bone Ripper, then pointed at the column closest to the Magister. Bone Ripper dropped back into the reservoir with a loud splash and began to swim towards the other causeway. Thanquol lashed his tail, amused by his own brilliance. He would wait for Bone Ripper to attack the wizard. While Scrivener was busy trying to stave off the rat ogre, Thanquol would be able to bring the full fury of his sorcery against the meddling Magister. The Grey Seer teased a nugget of warpstone from the hidden pocket of his robe. He stared at its black, shining depths. There was danger in using warpstone, even the most carefully refined warpstone, to fuel spells. But in this case, Thanquol decided the risk was worth it. With the wizard gone, there could be no question of his plan's success. 2 cities would die, and with their deaths, the glory of Thanquol would be like an ocean of magma blazing through the caverns of the Under Empire. Thanquol popped the piece of warpstone into his mouth, feeling its burn against his tongue. Soon, the moment would come. He would unleash such havoc upon the wizard that all that would be left of him was a greasy smear. No, that was the warpstone talking. He had to be careful. Only use enough power to get the job done. Dead was dead. He didn't need to make a spectacle of the wizard's destruction. Then, with Scrivener gone, Thanquol could savour his triumph. There would be none to oppose him then. Fresh sounds and scents from the tunnel caused Thanquol to spin around. The grey Seer nearly choked upon his warpstone as he saw a horde of chittering, green-clad Skaven pour onto the ledge. Plague monks, the vile heretics of Clan Pestilence. Thanquol was under no delusion about their purpose here and what they had come for. He lifted his amulet. The richly jewelled medallion engraved the sacred symbol of the horned rat. Thanquol scowled at the image, thinking of this fresh batch of adversaries come to stand between himself and his triumphs. "Are you testing me, Horned One?" Thanquol demanded. Johann dropped down onto the scaffolding and fired the pistol he had been given by Theodore Bale full into the face of a rat man climbing up to meet him. The monster squealed and hurtled into the abyss below the reservoir wall. Other shots sounded, and Johann risked a quick turn of his neck to see Grimbold standing on the ledge wall above him. The dwarf's leather apron was hanging open now, its surface fitted with loops through which had been secured an array of fat-muzzled pistols. Tongs secured the weapons to the loops in the apron, and as the dwarf began his fusillade, he let each gun drop from his hand, slapping against his belly as the thong... Oh, sorry guys, as the tongue, I hope he's not wearing a thong, as the tongue prevented it from falling. Sorry about that. The dwarf quickly filled his hands with fresh pistols and continued to persecute the cringing, slinking beasts. "If you don't want to catch your death from plague, Mangling," Grimbold chuckled, meeting Johann's stare, "kill the ratkin before their stink gets in your nose." The smuggler nodded his understanding and fumblingly tried to reload his weapon. The punishment the dwarf had delivered with his barrage had not quite been enough to drive the Skaven into retreat. Valkonen's deadly throwing knives picked ratmen from the scaffolding as they tried to swarm the men, pitching still more of the monsters into the darkness. And yet, still they came, encouraged by the feral snarls of their leader, a crook-backed old ratman with a stumpy tail. Sight of the defiant ratkin enraged Armando. The Tiliad hurled an epithet that would have shocked the ears of the Lord of Murder and threw his empty pistol after it. Shrieking furiously in his native tongue, Armando rushed across the scaffold to break the Skaven attack in the surest way he knew, by killing their leader. "Someone stop that fool!" Theodore barked. Before he knew what was happening, Johann found himself running after Armando. The smuggler leapt over the blade of a ratman crawling up from the underside of the scaffold, punctuating the maneuver by kicking the monster's teeth down its throat. He didn't linger to see if the blow caused the ratkin to lose his grip, but pressed on in his rush to save Armando from the suicidal frenzy that had seized him. The crook-backed ratman was snarling and spitting at the others now, calling them back to protect it from the Tilian. The ratman drew its own pistol from the filthy rags that served it as clothes and raised it to fire at Armando. Johann heard a shot sound from behind him. The crook-backed rat jumped in pain as a bullet smashed into it, its own pistol falling from its paw as pain from its wound seized it. Armando gave a cry of triumph, leaping down to the last platform between himself and his prey. A ratman reared up before him, slashing at him with its notched blade. The Tilian screamed as the sword clove into his leg, then brought his own sword smashing down into the Ratkin's head, scraping against its skull and ripping an ear and most of its scalp free from the bone beneath. Johann dropped down to drag Armando away, but the Tilian shook him off, pointing at the cowering rat leader. "I killed that pig! You take me back!" Armando growled. Johann had no chance to argue. At that instant, the seemingly dead ratman at Armando's feet found some measure of strength in its dying body. With a hiss, the Skaven buried its fangs into the Tilian's foot. Armando shrieked in shock and pain, then brought the edge of his blade slashing across the monster's throat, banishing its filthy life for good. Foul black blood sprayed as Armando opened the ratman's neck, splashing across Johann's body. The smuggler felt disgust at contact with the loathsome ichor, but quickly this was forgotten as tearing, crawling pain racked his body. It felt like his body was ripping itself apart from within, like his veins were trying to slither free from his flesh. Johann clawed at his skin, trying to combat the itching sensation. He slumped to the shaking floor of the platform, horrified by what he was doing. Armando, stunned by the strange agony that had seized Johann, was torn from his blind rage and turned to help his comrade in arms. A shot sounded out, and most of the Tilian's face vanished in a spray of blood and bone. On the higher platform, Johann could see the crook-backed ratman fling aside a second pistol. The monster glared at him for a moment, then threw itself at the causeway edge above it. No man could have made such a leap, nor found purchase for his grasping fingers, but the wiry ratman managed the impossible. An instant its stumpy tail swung from the lip of the causeway. Then Johann heard a splash as the rat leader threw himself into the reservoir. The reason for the ratman's flight was revealed as Johann heard men rushing across the platforms. "More ratmen have swarmed into the cavern," Theodore shouted at Johann. "We need a defensible position on the other side to fend them off." Johann only dimly heard the exchange. He was too busy staring at his arm, at the disgusting suggestion of movement beneath his skin where the black blood of the Skaven had stained it. He reached a hand towards Armando's body to see if the Tilian's flesh was also affected, trying desperately to deny the hideous truth fighting to dominate his brain. He recoiled, biting down on his lip to keep from screaming. Not only was Armando's skin unmarked, but as his hand reached towards his head, where the sickly glowing warpstone bullet the ratman had fired was lodged in his skull, Johann saw a filthy green worm-like growth push itself free from his wrist. Poisoned. Poisoned by that damnable stone from the sewer. Poisoned like his brother. He saw in his mind the ghastly scene of his brother's deathbed, the filth and the horror of that lingering sickness. The wizard had known. Johann realized the fact with a sickening horror. Scrivener's terrible familiar had smelled it on him. Perhaps the wizard had known even before that. He had known, and he had said nothing. Johann rose to his feet, glaring at the causeway where the wizard stood before the oncoming horde. "It's suicide to go back," Valkonen snarled at him. Johann nodded stiffly to Valkonen. "Sounds like exactly what the doctor ordered," Johann said, then turned and hurried to fit words to deeds. The festering ranks of the plague monks came scuttling out of the tunnel like so many rotting corpses, their fur hanging from their emaciated limbs in mangy strips, their frayed robes crusty with filth from their decaying bodies, and in each rheumy eye the ecstatic madness of the true fanatic. The plague monks did not see horror in their abominable condition. They saw power. Instinctively, Thanquol looked past the mouldering mob of common plague monks, over the cowls and the hoods of the frenzied wretches swinging obscene incense censers over their heads, past the diseased dregs carrying profane, fly-strewn icons of crumbling bone and rusting iron, beyond the shrieking zealots with prayer scrolls clenched in their scrawny fists. He looked beyond the tide of madness, sinking the master of this deranged throng. He found him, perched upon the backs of 4 bulky rat-men who had somehow managed to retain some semblance of strength, despite the ravages of their many ills. Thanquol hissed an oath through his fangs. He knew that filthy rat, the insane, gibbering heretic who stood at the position of command behind his miserable congregation. Lord Skrok, perhaps second only to Nurglich himself in the loathsome ranks of Clan Pestilence and the foul plague priests. Skrok caught Thanquol's eye. The plague lord's lips peeled back, displaying his rotten smile. There was a look of unspeakable triumph in Skrok's expression, as though all the hate and malice in his entire clan had been boiled down into a single display of emotion. Thanquol knew Nurglich wanted the Wormstone for himself and Clan Pestilence alone. Accepting the will of the council had been a ruse. His true plan had been to send Lord Skrok to steal the Wormstone once Thanquol found it. And if, in the process, the Grey Seer was eliminated, so much the better for Skrok and Nurglich. Thanquol's killing of Plague Lord Scratsquick would be avenged. With the Wormstone in their possession, Clan Pestilence would need fear no retaliation for striking down one of the Horned Rat's sacred priests. Thanquol bit down on the warpstone in his mouth, feeling its fiery power blaze through him. His vision became a brilliance of golden light. His arms felt as though they swelled with power. He could see the swirling threads of magic all around him, the grey darkness surrounding the human wizard, the green putrescence that billowed from Skrok. They were as nothing to Thanquol's enhanced sight, petty tricks drawing upon but a few of the sorcerer's strands that writhed all around them. The Grey Seer would show them real power. He would show them true magic. Chittering wildly, Thanquol opened himself to the etheric forces surrounding him, drawing all the many strands of magic into his body and into his mind. He formed the power into a thought, forced the thought to become purpose, forced the purpose to become action, forced the action to become words, gestures, binding the power with the secret knowledge handed down to the Grey Seers by the Horned Rat himself. Skrok, the pathetic heathen, would suffer for his impiety. The Horned Rat would gnaw the heretic's bones. As he started to point the blazing head of his staff towards the corrupt Plague Lord, Thanquol's sorcery-soaked vision noticed another figure drawing arcane energies into itself. The efforts of this one were even more laughable than those of Scribenor and Skrok. like a whelp trying to raise a rat ogre's maul. Yet, there was something naggingly familiar, insufferably annoying about the pathetic aura of the wretch. Thanquol's fangs snapped together, grinding against each other as he realized who the little scum mage was. Adept Cratch. The treacherous little bastard flea was still alive. He was there, at the fore of the plague monks, his grey robes cast aside for the green decay of his new friends. The riddle of how Skrulk had found him was solved. The plague monks were here courtesy of some trick of his deceitful former apprentice. Cratch vanished in a blaze of green gold fire. The fur stripped from his bones as he was engulfed by the full fury of Thanquol's magic. Plague monks near him pitched and fell, their hearts burst by the magnitude of the sorcery that had smashed into the adept. Other plague monks whimpered and howled as the refuse of Cratch's sorry carcass splashed onto them, greasy black drops that sizzled and burned whatever they touched. Thanquol felt every eye in the cavern drawn to him as shocked silence drowned out the roar of battle. Man, dwarf and Skaven, every face was pinched with horror at the unfathomable power the Grey Seer had unleashed. Fur and hair stood on end. Patches of ice bobbed upon the surface of the reservoir. The air itself seemed charged, flickering with a weird afterglow along the course the Grey Seer's annihilating blast had taken. Even Lord Skrulk's blemished face was filled with astonished terror. If the decayed villain still had functioning glands, Thanquol knew they must be spurting the musk of fear like a runt in a snake pit. The Grey Seer straightened, holding himself high as he felt the terrified appreciation of his enemies. Then his pride wilted, along with the tremendous strength he had imagined flowing through his limbs only moments before. Thanquol struggled to keep standing, succeeding only in sliding down the length of his staff, wilting into a weary pile upon the stones of the causeway. Bile rose through his throat, burning as he vomited a mix of warpstone and blood. Quivering like a leaf, Thanquol tried to focus his vision. It was a horrible effort, his brain swimming with pulses of pain and throbbing against the inside of his skull as though trying to batter its way out of his head. Across the stone ledge, Skrulk's eyes were not having the same problem holding the image of his enemy. Gone was the terror, and in its place a snickering scorn. Thanquol had drawn such incredible power, unleashed such unspeakable havoc, and to what purpose? Skrulk lived, as did more than enough of his vile disciples to slaughter both Thanquol's miserable servitors and the meddling human wizard's agents. Skrulk's bubbling laughter oozed through the cavern, echoing from the walls. It would be some time before Thanquol could muster the concentration for even the most minor cantrip. Before that happened, he intended to be wearing the Grey Seer's entrails for a belt. Thanquol groaned as his vision finally steadied. He saw Skrulk clap his paws together, saw two mammoth shapes emerge from the tunnel. Horror clawed at the Grey Seer's heart. The things that lurched out onto the ledge were rat ogres, brutes nearly the equal of Bone Ripper in size. Where his bodyguard had prodigious strength and savagery, however, These had the same diseased viciousness of the plague monks. Their emaciated bodies were nests of boils and sores, their flesh betraying a leprous tint, rabid foam dripping from their black-toothed maws. He didn't need Skrog's pointing finger to tell him what victim the Plague Lord had chosen for his monsters. Thankwall tried to lift himself, but his wobbly legs just crumpled beneath his weight. He ripped the escape scroll from his belt, but his pounding head and bleary vision would not cooperate enough to read the complex spell. The grey seer groaned again, smacking his horned head against the cold stone beneath him. It had been a fit of temperamental stupidity, an outburst of temporary madness, satisfying as obliterating crash might have been. It was a woeful tactical blunder. Jeremiah Scrivener struggled to maintain the bonds of shadow wrapped about the gigantic hulk of Bone Ripper. The rat ogre refused to submit, forcing his huge body onwards. Regardless of how much power the wizard put into his spell, inch by inch the monster was breaking free. His tiny brain too dull to submit to Scrivener's magic. More formidable even than the grotesque rat beast had been in Dr. Lowe's workshop, Bone Ripper had enough of a mind to focus upon the commands of his master. The rat ogre had been told to attack the wizard, and whatever Scrivener did, he was determined to obey that command. Scrivener glanced at the gloating grey seer. He knew the fiend's intention. Callous as all his breed, the rat mage would wait until the wizard was completely and hopelessly occupied by Bone Ripper, then Thankwall would leap to the attack. Scrivener knew there was no hope that the grey seer would stay his magical assault out of concern for his bodyguard. For any Skaven, there was only one life that was not expendable: his own. The wizard began to slowly fall back along the causeway. If he could put enough distance between himself and Bone Ripper, he might be able to strike Thankwall before his bodyguard could reach him. He struggled to tighten the wispy fetters wrapped about Bone Ripper's legs, but the monster stubbornly pressed on, slogging through the arcane chains like a behemoth trudging through a quagmire. Scrivener could not gain enough ground on the brute. If he ended his spell, Bone Ripper would be upon him before he could even wag a finger at the gloating Thankwall. "Master!" The harsh bellow sounded from behind Scrivener. The wizard recognized the voice as that of Grimbold Silverbeard. The dwarf had extricated himself from the fight on the scaffold. His pistols spent, his hands instead were filled with black metal objects, found at the base, then tapering to a point from which a hemp fuse protruded. "Buck!" Scrivener ordered his minion. The wizard could read the concern in Grimbold's voice, but the dwarf had a much more important role to play in the drama unfolding around the reservoir. If he could not stop the Skaven, it would be left to Grimbold to cheat them of their victory. "Do not interfere," the wizard snarled when he saw the dwarf set down the bombs and start to reload one of his pistols. A shot at the rat ogre would only enrage him further, allowing the brute to completely break free of Scrivener's tenuous hold. A shot at the grey seer might only wound the fiend and make Grimbold the new target of Thankwall's wrath. As things stood, Scrivener himself was more expendable than the dwarf. The Magister restored his attention to Bone Ripper, struggling to push the Hulk back. Bone Ripper growled, snapping his fangs and flexing his claws in a primitive display of his ghastly strength. Scrivener was not intimidated by the brute's bestial boasting. It was enough to tax his mind just keeping the monster enmeshed in his coils. Scrivener's fixation upon the task at hand bore tragic fruit. Too late was he aware of a new menace lurking close by. He twisted his body around, shouting a warning, but the word came out too late. With skill to match that of the wizard, made all the more impressive because it did not depend upon magic and illusion to accomplish. A black-clad shape emerged from the shadows. Snarling, the shape pounced on Grimbold, knocking the pistol from the dwarf's hands. Grimbold staggered, his beard darkening as blood seeped into it from a ragged wound in his chest. Stabbed in the back, the dwarf's armor had folded like cheesecloth before the unnatural venom of an assassin's blade. The dwarf had time to stare into the face of his killer before slumping to the ground. Scratch Scarpaw sneered at the dying dwarf, raising his poison blade for another thrust. The blow never fell. Black blood exploded from Scarpaw's mouth as his body was bisected by a lance of darkness made solid. The assassin's confusion and disbelief was a mirror of the expression that had filled Grimbold's face. He looked from the magic spear that had ripped through him to the causeway. He shook his head, refusing to accept what he saw. The wizard had attacked him, voluntarily abandoning his spell against Bone Ripper to strike down the dwarf's killer. Madness. Scarpaw's brain screamed, to the last unable to understand the peculiarly human concepts of loyalty and sacrifice. Scarpaw's body crashed to the causeway, then rolled over the edge, sinking slowly into the cold waters of the reservoir. Only his dropped blade and Grimbold's bleeding body gave silent testimony that he had even existed at all. Scrivener hastily began to cast a new spell. He knew it was hopeless, and his knowledge was proven as a fierce, vice-like grip closed around him. The wizard was wrenched from the floor, the hot breath of Bone Ripper washing over him. He felt ribs cracking beneath the cruel pressure of the beast's paws. Bone Ripper's mutant third arm drew back, the blood-crusted length of its fist spike poised for the killing blow. The Magitor spent his last moment invoking a death curse that would take his killer with him. He only hoped that the Grey Seer was petty enough to still use his magic to finish his foe, rather than allowing Bone Ripper's brawn to settle the score. Neither spell nor fist fell. Confusion showed on Bone Ripper's dull features, the brute staring in perplexity at the ledge. Scrivener could tell that something unexpected had happened. Diseased cries and a stagnant stench told him what had happened without the need to look. More Skaven had arrived, but these were no allies of Bone Ripper or his master. Easily distracted by the unexpected, the rat ogre lost his focus. Where a moment before Scrivener had braced himself for certain death, now he seized opportunity. Instead of finishing his death curse, he instead wove a new spell from the grey wind of magic. The rat ogre was oblivious to his incantation. Bone Ripper's dull mind instead watching his master work himself into a fit of anger. The first Bone Ripper was aware something was amiss was when the physical substance that had been Jeremiah Scrivener seeped through his thick fingers in long streams of darkness. The rat ogre stared stupidly at his empty paws, scratching his horn with his mutant hand. The darkness that had become the wizard reformed into a human shape only a few feet from the immense monster. The dangerous magic changing the corporeal into the incorporeal. Scrivener had trusted his spell only as far as he needed to escape Bone Ripper's clutch. Now the wizard stood between the monster and Grimbold's body. The dwarf had served him faithfully for many years. Scrivener would not abandon him while there was still the flicker of life in him. Not while Grimbold still might have a role to play, saving the capital of the entire empire from a hideous fate. Bone Ripper must have smelled Scrivener as he took shape once more. The rat ogre stopped staring at his empty hands and instead glared at the Magister. Drool glistened as the monster roared his rage. The rat ogre started to rush towards Scrivener, but then his roar was drowned out by an even more monstrous sound. The entire cavern shook. The air burst into golden light. The wizard shielded himself with his cloak as ice erupted from the reservoir in bursts. Impossibly powerful magic had been unleashed, sorcery both awesome and reckless. The wild, raw malevolence of absolute destruction. He knew he was fortunate that such a spell had not been unleashed upon himself, for there was no curse or charm or protective talisman known to mortals that could have withstood it. It was like the fist of an angry god smiting down from the heavens or up from the hells. When the aftershock of the arcane blast had dissipated enough for Scrivener to focus his thoughts again, he saw Thanquol staggered on the next causeway. He saw the newly arrived Skaven, green-robed plague monks, rushing forwards at the command of their putrescent leader. At the head of the chittering host were a pair of hulking rat ogres, festering kin of Bone Ripper's breed. True to Scrivener's prediction, these were no allies of the Grey Seer. Indeed, they seemed oblivious to the wizard in their haste to settle with Thanquol. Scrivener lifted Grimbold from the ground, moving him just in time to prevent the dwarf from being crushed underfoot by Bone Ripper as the monster thundered past. With a brain too small to hold Scrivener's illusions, he was intelligent enough to recognize the peril threatening his master. Like a loyal dog, the Bone Ripper was rushing to protect Thanquol from his enemies. It was not fear for Thanquol that caused Scrivener to shout orders to his men, commanding them to attack the plague monks. It was a matter of choosing the lesser of two evils. Thanquol would use the Wormstone if given the chance. The plague monks, however, might do much worse. Scrivener knew about their fiendish ability to create new diseases and ways of distributing them. Given a chance, they might not only use the Wormstone, they might be capable of replicating the spells that had created it. They might be able to make more. Bone Ripper ploughed through the swarming mass of plague monks, smashing and crushing them with his monstrous claws. The diseased rat men refused to break, chittering and snarling as they leapt upon their hulking attacker. Rusty daggers sank into the rat ogre's leather hide. Staves of worm-eaten wood splintered against his bones. Yellow fangs ripped at his flesh. The monster's charge floundered as plague monks threw themselves at him with lunatic abandon. Before he had taken more than a dozen steps onto the stone shelf, Bone Ripper's shape vanished beneath a clinging, clawing mass of ragged green robes and leprous flesh. Even the mutant's prodigious strength faltered before the onslaught. He stumbled, dropping to one knee. A plague monk shrieked as he was crushed by Bone Ripper's shifting weight. But the wretch's maniacal brethren gave his fate passing notice. Chanting their obscene prayers to their vile god, the plague monks struggled all the harder to bring their prey down. Rescue came from an unexpected source. Shots rang out, blasting clinging ratmen from Bone Ripper's body. Scrivener's minions had heard their master's command and rushed to attack their new and horrific foes. Plague monks turned to meet the renewed assault by the humans, snarling their vile shrieks as they surged towards the scaffold. Crazed Skaven wielding smouldering censers of rusted iron led the charge. The pestilential fumes spewing from the foul incense almost visibly corrupting their wasted bodies as they scurried to the attack. Theodore Bayer held the survivors of Scrivener's band together, ordering them into a rough skirmish line. Those few who still bore loaded pistols fired into the diseased throng, spilling another pair of ratmen onto the ground. The filthy stink of incense and disease reached out to the men, threatening to engulf them in a fog of plague and decay. Suddenly, the charging ratmen were lost beneath a shroud of darkness, a cloak of shadow that descended upon them like a falling curtain. The diseased ratmen howled and whined, shrieking and chittering in confusion and frustration with rage. Some, confused by the supernatural darkness, rushed too far forwards, choking as they entered the cloud of noxious fumes spewing from their heavy flail-like censers. Less injured to the smoky filth than the censer bearers, these ratmen writhed on the ground, coughing and bleeding as the fumes overwhelmed their diseased, ravaged bodies. The spell of darkness did no more than delay the charge of the plague monks. Lost in a frenzy of bloodlust and hate, the acolytes of Clan Pestilence were not so easily provoked into fright as the hapless minions of Thanquol had been in the basement of the Orc and Axe. They used their keen sense of smell to pursue their prey through the murk, emerging on the other side of the wizard's spell in a snarling mass. Scrivener's agents had not been idle while the plague monks were blinded. Instead of holding their skirmish line, as soon as the wizard's spell had struck, the men turned and fled back onto the scaffold. With as much haste as their weary bodies could summon, the men ran, retreating before the vengeful mob of ratmen chittering for their blood. Such was the maddening bloodlust of the plague monks, they scarcely paused as they scrambled onto the wooden scaffolding to give chase. Ratmen were knocked from the rickety platforms by the reckless haste of their comrades and the press of the frenzied mob behind them. Their shrieks as they fell into the cavern were all but lost beneath the obscene chanting and hungry chittering of those who swarmed across the scaffolding, hot on the heels of their enemies. Another sound was also lost to the ears of the snarling pack. Designed to support the weight of a few men at a time, the scaffolds groaned and sagged beneath the scrambling mass of plague monks. Ropes snapped, boards splintered. Too late, some of the plague monks sensed their peril. Fear swept through the swarm of green-cloaked fanatics, transforming into panic as the less desiccated Skaven began to vent their glands. No longer did they pursue the tiny band of humans who were climbing onto the stone ledge at the far side of the reservoir. Instead, they fought and clawed and pushed to reach the safety of the near ledge, to find a refuge from the wooden platforms that creaked and buckled beneath their paws. Few of the plague monks reached the security of the ledge before, with a titanic groan, the first section of scaffolding broke and tumbled into the chasm. The dissolution of one section aggravated the distress of the others. The plague monks wailed and screamed as the entire scaffold broke away, carrying the swarming fanatics with it as it toppled hundreds of feet to the rocky slopes below. Upon the shelf, Werner tore the last stubborn plague monks from his body, smashing them into gory paste upon the floor. The rat ogre, blood dripping from hundreds of cuts and bites, pounded his paws against his throbbing chest, creating a drum-like report. He wiped blood from his jaws, his beady eyes squinting at the ragged survivors from his assault and the ill-fated chase onto the scaffold. The plague monks shivered, frozen with fear. Only their blister-faced chieftain seemed unfazed by the menace of the rat ogre. Calmly, Lord Skroll clapped his leprous hands together and pointed a shriveled claw at Bone Ripper. Two gigantic shapes turned at the Plague Lord's summons, their rheumy eyes fixing upon Bone Ripper's mangled bulk. Nox and Pox lumbered away from the causeway, leaving Thanquol to the plague monks who had already crawled out ahead of them. Like roaming wolves, the two diseased rat ogres circled their prey, their blackened teeth grinning from behind their crusty lips. They were not so far gone to the ravages of pestilence and plague that their tiny brains had forgotten the pleasures of life, such as an enemy wounded and outnumbered, just waiting for their fangs to close about his throat. Nox growled, a sound like the wheeze of a dying mammoth. The rat ogre's snarl drew Bone Ripper's attention, the mutant brute roaring his own defiance at the decaying abomination. Nox, however, made no move to close with Bone Ripper. A vile cunning lingered in the diseased, ravaged minds of the plague ogres. As Bone Ripper turned towards Nox, Pox charged the mutant's back. The plague ogre's thick arms wrapped about Bone Ripper's body, crushing him in a bear hug that pinned his limbs against his sides. Pox's slobbering mouth worried at Bone Ripper's neck, shredding his flesh and soaking the abomination's muzzle in the mutant's dark blood. Bone Ripper shrieked in pain as the plague ogre's fangs gnawed into him. He tried to twist his head around, to slash Pox with his horn. The plague ogre ducks the clumsy attack, shifting his grip and sinking his fangs into Bone Ripper's shoulder. Seeing Pox launch his attack, Nox rushed the besieged Bone Ripper, rabid froth bubbling from his diseased jaws. The plague ogre raised a clawed hand to slash open Bone Ripper's belly, but the blow never fell. Bone Ripper slashed at the monster with his tail, driving the spiked steel ball Thanquol had nailed to the tip of the rat ogre's scaly tail against the knee of the plague ogre. Nox gibbered in pain as his knee exploded beneath the strike. The bones of his lower leg shattering as the plague ogre's full weight pressed down upon him. Nox smashed against the floor, fangs snapping from rotten gums as his face smacked into the stone. Startled by his fellow's alarming distress, Pox failed to remember his early evasions of Bone Ripper's horn. The steel-capped sliver of bone scraped across the plague ogre's face, bringing treacly blood spurting from a deep gash that ran from forehead to chin. Pox reared back, instinctively recoiling from the source of his wound. Bone Ripper's arm, unrestrained now by Pox's crushing hug, stabbed at the plague ogre's head. The monster released Bone Ripper and staggered away, clutching at his blood-soaked face. Bone Ripper sniffed at the putrid eye impaled upon his fist spike, then growled his own challenge to the plague ogres. Slowly, the mangled monsters lurched against their foe, snarling their own defiance. Beast came against beast. There would be no quarter in such a struggle. The only measure of victory would be the cold, still bodies of the vanquished. Jeremiah Scribner stared down into the bloody face of Grimbold Silverbeard. There was more shame than pain in the dwarf's eyes as he stared back. That changed as the wizard's palm slapped against his grisly wound. The dwarf gritted his teeth as he felt the Magister's magic pour into his body. "I am no healer," Scribner warned him. "Against the poison of the Skaven, even a healer might be of no use. But my magic will slow the Ratkin's venom." Grimbold nodded, fumbling at the straps of his apron. Tearing it loose, he exposed a set of bandoliers that crisscrossed his chest. More of the curious metal bombs were secured to the loops of the belts. The fuses will burn even in the water," the dwarf grinned, an effect ruined by the blood staining his teeth. "No time to set them proper, but I know where they will do the job." A grim laugh rumbled from the dwarf's throat. Wizard and dwarf looked up as they were joined across the causeway. Johann Dietrich had not followed Theodore Bayer across the scaffold. Something more terrible than Skaven and monsters had seized the smuggler's mind. He pointed at his torn shirt, at the crawling things he could see just beneath the surface of his skin. "Why didn't you tell me?" Johann demanded. "Would knowing have made any difference?" Scribner answered coldly. "There is nothing that can be done." "Well, I should have known," growled Johann. "You should have told me." "Count it a blessing, Manlin," coughed Grimbold. "It's not everyone learns the hour of his death. It's not everyone can make his last minutes such to make his ancestors proud." Scribner pointed at Johann. "Crawl into a hole and die, or stay and help avenge your brother. The choice is yours, but choose quickly." Before Johann could even think about the wizard's words, the shadows seemed to reach out and surround the Magister. Scribner's figure darkened until it was indistinguishable from the blackness around him. Then, as man and shadow merged into one, both slowly faded into nothingness. Grimbold shook his head sadly and started to drag himself across the causeway, leaving Johann alone with his thoughts and his decision. Grey Seer Thanquol watched with horror as Skrulk's abominable minions charged the causeway. Even the onset of Bone Ripper's valiant attack had not been enough to break their diseased determination. Worse, the stupid rat ogre had allowed himself to become embroiled in a scuffle with Skrulk's disgusting beasts, leaving Thanquol alone against the plague monks. Thanquol managed to rise to his feet, leaning heavily on his staff for support. His head was spinning, swimming with colours and sounds only he could sense. His guts felt on fire, his limbs still shook as muscles twitched and shivered. Too much power used unwisely had left the grey Seer as helpless as a whelp. It was fortunate, then, that the last of his own underlings did not appreciate just how helpless their tyrannical leader was. If they had, they would certainly have abandoned him, or perhaps even tried to gain some favour with Clan Pestilence by delivering Thanquol to Lord Scrope. However, the Grey Seer's awful displays of sorcery had impressed upon his minions the magnitude of his power, filling their hearts and minds with a lingering fear. Instead of fleeing, the Warlock engineers who had circled the entire reservoir to avoid Scrivener and joined Thanquol pulled pistols and fired into the oncoming plague monks. The foremost of the fanatics shrieked and fell into the icy waters. Those behind hesitated, unwilling to be the next to die from such a sudden barrage. Thanquol snarled at the two Warlock engineers. Killing the plague monks was all fine and good, but the vermin had more important work to do. He pointed a talon at one masked ratman, gesturing at the leather bag slung from his left shoulder. "Leave the wormstone!" Thanquol snapped through clenched fangs. He pointed to an almost identical leather bag hanging from the engineer's other shoulder. Keep the heretic maggots back away, while I do what needs to be done." The Warlock engineer nodded his head in almost eager fashion and dropped the heavy leather bag down beside his comrade. His gloved paws rummaged in the other bag, producing a globe of smoky glass. Tightening valves on the sides of his mask, the Skaven scurried forwards and hurled the globe at the lurking plague monks. The glass grenade shattered on the stone of the causeway, spewing an acidic fog that corroded the flesh from the plague monks caught in the mephitic cloud. Shrieking in agony, the wounded Skaven leapt into the reservoir, but the cold waters did nothing to stifle their burning flesh. Other plague monks, killed outright, lay sprawled upon the causeway, foul steam rising from their smouldering carcasses. The Warlock engineer chittered madly as he saw the terror on the faces of the other plague monks, pulled a second poisoned wind globe from his bag. Grey Seer Thanquol turned his attention away from the Globadier, fixing his gaze instead upon the engineer beside him. He gestured at the bag the Globadier had discarded and at the similar one the Warlock engineer held. "You, dump poor wormstone into pool, quick! The Grey Seer put a growl into his voice to spur the hesitant engineer onwards. Thanquol had no intention of getting any closer to the wormstone than he already was. The risk he was perfectly content to leave to his underling. Once the reservoir was safely contaminated, he'd then be free to use the escape scroll, secure in knowing that his victory was complete. The Warlock engineer drew heavy gloves of chain and copper from his belt before opening either of the bags. Gingerly, he started to lift one of the wine bottles from the bag. Thanquol glanced away for only an instant, checking that the Globadier was still holding the plague monks back. When he looked again at the engineer, he found the Skaven sprawled across the causeway, his throat slashed from ear to ear. Standing over him, dripping wet from his swim in the reservoir, was old Scrim Nortail. The clan school spy glared at Thanquol, fangs bared in contemptuous snarl. "Thanquol meat is finished," Scrim snapped. The spy's grin broadened as his claws closed around the strap of the leather bag holding the bottles of wormstone. "I sense your treachery, Grey Flea. I shall be hero of Under Altdorf when they learn I saved them from your poison." The old rat man grunted with effort as he lifted the heavy burden. His crooked back trembled as he tried to straighten. For an instant, his attention was away from Thanquol. It was a mistake Scrim would never have made in his younger days, but those days were long past. Crippled by age, instincts dulled by time, the spy could not concentrate upon both the grey Seer and the heavy bag. Thanquol sprang at the spy, smashing the metal head of his staff into Scrim's grey head. The spy uttered a shrill gasp, then crumpled to the floor, blood spurting from his cracked skull. Thanquol scrambled to grab the bag of wormstone, but the satchel was already slipping from Scrim's dead clutch. The grey Seer gave voice to a furious wail as he watched the leather bag drop from Scrim's fingers and sink into the black depths of the reservoir, its lethal contents harmless and inert inside their bottles. Scowling, Thanquol kicked Scrim's lifeless body, the ferocity of his vindictive rage snapping the spy's neck as his foot smashed against the side of his head. Still not content, Thanquol swatted the twitching corpse with his staff, sending it rolling into the icy reservoir. Turning, the grey Seer smiled as he saw the second bag of wormstone bottles. There would still be enough to poison the reservoir and kill his enemies. Thanquol reached his paw towards the leather bag. Then suddenly, he cringed away from his objective. Standing just beyond the grey Seer, between himself and the lone globadier, holding back the crazed hordes of clown pestilens, was a figure draped in charcoal grey cloak and hood. Once more, Thanquol felt the wizard's intense gaze bore down upon him. Thanquol fought down the fear Scrivener's abrupt appearance provoked. The grey Seer fingered his protective talismans, wondering if any of them would be potent enough to dispel the Magister's magic. He did not display his fear, however. Instead, he screwed his body up into the most imperious posture. "Leave go," Thanquol pronounced. "You may warn tell the humans not to taste the water. It is the traitor rats of Under Altdorf I will destroy. You go, warn the Emperor. Be good hero for all mad things." This does generous Thanquol offer his worthy enemy. Mocking laughter rewarded the grey Seer's proposal. Slowly, his stormy eyes still fixed upon Thanquol's beady orbs, Scrivener drew his sword from its sheath. "Your sorcery has betrayed you," the wizard's chilling hiss sounded, forming the words in perfect Queekish. "Take your blade, grey Seer, and find your death with spleen." Thanquol backed away from the wizard's challenge. His paw fell to his belt, but it was not his sword he fingered, but rather the escape scroll. Would he have enough time, he wondered, to invoke the spell before Scrivener could run him through with his sword? Suddenly, Thanquol found himself with more pressing concerns. Peering past the wizard, Thanquol could see the globadier engulfed by a stream of burning green filth. The warlock engineer's leather garments dissolved in the vile spray, his fur and flesh dripping off his bones as the corrosive consumed him utterly. His dripping skeleton made a loathsomely squishy sound as it collapsed to the floor. beyond the Globadier's steaming wreckage, Thankwell could see the Ratman's killer. Lord Skrulk wiped a paw across his dripping jaws, wiping away little burning bits of residue from his mouth. Like the fabled plague dragon Bubos. Bubos, not Bubos. Something on my mind there. Sorry about these mistakes. Like the fabled plague dragon Bubos, Skrulk had used his magic to spit searing death at the Warlock engineer. The Plague Lord chuckled grotesquely as he plodded forwards, pestilential vapours rising from the bowl of his censer staff. The fanatic's decayed paw caressed the rat-skin binding of the massive book that swung from a chain on his belt. Thankwell's fur bristled with horrified recognition. The book was the Liber Bubonicus, an abominable artifact stolen from the disciples of the horrific dark god Nurgle by Clan Pestilence long ago. Thankwell, and indeed all the Grey Seers, had thought the abomination long since destroyed. Knowing that Skrulk had studied the book's spells of plague and destruction, the Grey Seer found himself even more eager to evoke his escape spell. Scrivener saw the horror in Thankwell's eyes. The wizard knew that, for now at least, the Grey Seer could not draw upon his magic, his body still recovering from the rampant excess of the spell that had obliterated Cratch. If he was still confident in his own powers, he would hardly have tried to wheedle a deal from the wizard. Scrivener had sensed the discharge of Skrulk's black magic, and knew that there was another foe who was not so drained as the Grey Seer. For Thankwell to find terror rather than rescue in such mazecraft, Scrivener knew the perpetrator could only be one of the Plague Priests, creatures he had already determined were an even greater threat than the Grey Seer. The grey-cloaked wizard spun about, glaring at Skrulk just as the Plague Lord opened his rotten mouth once more. A spew of maggot-ridden broth exploded from the decayed Skaven's jaws, a burning stream of noxious putrescence that glowed with the filthy light of unclean gods. Such a breath of rotting disease had destroyed the Globadier. Now Lord Skrulk evoked the same magic to settle with the meddling wizard and the cringing Thankwell. Talons of shadow swept down from the ceiling and up from beneath the causeway, intercepting the stream of plague magic swirling about the filth in a complex pattern that echoed the motions of Scrivener's wildly gesturing hands. Thankwell blinked in disbelief as he saw Skrulk's ghastly sorcery scattered by the Magister's arcane powers. Skrulk, however, was far from finished. Snarling, the Plague Lord reached to his rotten face, tearing one of his blemished eyes from his decayed skull. Thankwell realized with horror that Skrulk's staring eyes were not real, simply cleverly painted chips of warpstone. The Plague Lord uttered another croak of laughter as he popped his false eye into his mouth. Skrulk seemed to swell with power as the weird energies of the warpstone rushed through him. Scrivener's voice came in a low hiss, forming slithering words that seemed to chant the very air. He was drawing upon the last reserves of his own power to ward off what was coming, tapping spells and energies that would drive most men mad. He invoked cold gods, ancient and strange, called to the slithering forces of lost worlds. Secret words, forbidden before the first man crawled from the slime, rasped past the Magister's hidden lips. His fingers cracked as he forced them into gestures nearly impossible for human anatomy to mimic. He only prayed it would be enough to stop the surging malignity of Skrulk's arcane might. Thanquol was less hopeful. He opened the escape scroll. His mouth started to form the first words of the incantation. Then his eyes darted to the bottles of wormstone lying on the causeway. He looked up, grinning as he saw Skrulk and Scrivener locked in their wizard's duel. Focused upon each other, there was nothing either of his enemies could do to stop him now. Thanquol the Mighty reached into the leather bag, snickering contently as he pulled the first bottle into the dim light. Jeremiah Scrivener struggled to maintain his sorcerer's shield against the noxious spellcraft of Lord Skrulk. Foul spell after foul spell smashed against the arcane defences he had erected, splattering against the shadowy folds of his magic like waves battering ashore. Skrulk did not throw his warpstone-fueled power into a single burst of havoc. Instead, the Plague Lord used it to craft a barrage of deathly magic that taxed Scrivener's powers to their limit. Beads of blood dripped from the wizard's pores as he struggled to maintain his focus and his strength. Inch by ghastly inch, he could feel Skrulk's malignity prevailing. The Plague Lord could smell the weakness of his foe and croaked with bubbling laughter. Skrulk's false eye saw the world in waves of purple and green. It had been many years since he had clawed his natural eyes from his face after beholding the wondrous putrescence of Arch-Plague Lord Nurchlich. Sorcery gave him sight, the same sorcery that now allowed him to crush the Grey Wizard and the Grey Seer like a pair of gnats. Slow and persistent as the holy poxes of the horned rat, Skrulk brought his insidious magic of corruption and decay gnawing at Scrivener's defences. A bellow snapped Skrulk's attention from the wizard. Scrivener wilted to the floor of the causeway as the Plague Lord's barrage of spells abruptly ceased, completely drained by his desperate efforts to hold back the monster's power. It was a different sort of monster and a different sort of power that threatened Lord Skrulk. Towering over the Plague Lord, his body torn and gashed, Bone Ripper glowered at his festering toad of a rat who thought to kill his master. The severed head of Nox hung from one of the rat ogre's claws. The better part of Pox's belly was skewered on the brute's horn. "Bone Ripper! Kill! Kill!" came a frantic shout from further along the causeway. The rat ogre, only a moment before looking as though he might pass out from fatigue and injury, abruptly rallied at the sound of Thanquol's shriek. Snarling, he slapped his chest with Nox's mangled head. The Lord Skrulk glared back at the beast with his last eye. The Plague Lord did not need spells to deal with such a brute. He tightened his hold on his staff, flicking a pinch of yellow powder into the smouldering bowl of the censer. "Bone Ripper, die, die," Skrulk snarled, lunging at the hulking brutes before he could attack. Bone Ripper swatted at the Plague Lord with his claw. Skrulk ducked beneath the wounded rat ogre's swipe, striking at him in turn with his sinister staff. The rod of corruption sank through the meat of Bone Ripper's arm as though it were butter, blisters and maggots spreading from the grisly, gangrenous wound. Bone Ripper howled in pain, lifting his injured arm to his face, sucking at the putrid rheum in a futile effort to ease the pain. "No, no, stupid brute! Kill, Skrulk! Kill, kill!" But it was already too late for Thanquol to command his bodyguard. Bone Ripper had drawn a lungful of the foul fumes spilling from Skrull's sensor into his body when he voiced his painful howl. Coupled with the vileness he drew into his belly when he sucked at his wound, the rat ogre's body was beset by the supernatural poxes of Clan Pestilence and their most abominable plague priest. Bone Ripper slumped to his knees as his flesh became pallid. His eyes rolled back in his skull as pus began dripping from his ears. The rat ogre's horns and claws became brittle, crumbling like clay. Bone Ripper opened his mouth to snap at the gloating Plague Lord, but his fangs fell out of his bleeding gums. Whining like a whipped cur, Bone Ripper crashed onto his face, his skull bursting like a crushed egg as he struck. Skrull licked the rat ogre's blood from his face as he turned back to his other foes. Where were we? The Plague Lord snarled. Oh, yes. First the wizard, then the fool. Lord Skrull lifted his paw, the claws glowing with foul energies. Scrivener could only watch as the Plague Lord began to work his magic. Thankwald fingered his protective charms, but knew they would be useless. He could still smell the warpstone fueling Skrull's malignant sorcery. Before Skrull could unleash his death spell, he was again beset by an enemy from behind. The Plague Lord's followers, faced with Bone Ripper's rage and the dire magics being unleashed by their own prophet, had abandoned Skrull, diving into the reservoir in their bid to find safety. In deserting their master, they had left the path open for Bone Ripper. In destroying Bone Ripper, Skrull had left the path open for a different kind of adversary. Johann did not shout or roar challenge to the decayed monster. He did not announce himself in some honourable call to battle. What he did was climb onto Bone Ripper's lifeless mass and leap down upon Skrull, locking one arm about the Skaven's waist, another about his throat. Skrull flailed in Johann's grasp, slithering and squirming like an eel in that clutch. Then the Plague Lord's diseased sight focused upon the state of the arm that was wrapped about his neck. He saw the ugly green-black worm growths squirming up from the man's skin. Johann Dietrich, last victim of the Wormstone. Even the decayed face of Lord Skrull was capable of expressing the horror of those worms writhing through. He knew what sort of death the worms would bring, and knew they were emptying from the man's body, being drawn into his own by the scent of the warpstone in his blood. Skrull redoubled his efforts to break free, clawing at the face of his captor, but Johann would not relent. Johann met the silent gaze of Scrivener's grey eyes. He saw a respect in those eyes, something approaching admiration beneath the swirling storm of shadow and fog. The wizard gave the slightest nod of his head. The smuggler tightened his hold upon the struggling Skrull and launched himself into the icy waters of the reservoir, dragging the squealing monster with him into the dark depths. Scrivener looked back at the last of the Skaven. Thankwald was perched at the edge of the causeway, upended wine bottles in each paw. More bottles lay empty all around the Grey Seer's feet. The wizard glared coldly at the laughing Skaven. His own icy smile was hidden beneath the folds of his scarf. He turned his head and shouted across the reservoir to a little shape lying upon the causeway nearest the restraining wall. His words were thick and harsh, the stony tones of Kazalid, the ancient tongue of the dwarves. "Honour your ancestors, Grimbold Silverbeard, and tell the gods the way of your death." The shape on the causeway shifted slightly, then plunged into the black embrace of the reservoir. An instant later, the entire cavern shook with such a roar as made even Thanquol's rage-filled spell seem the babble of a child. The shaking tremor spread, the roar intensified, and the entire restraining wall seemed to lift up, then come crashing down again. Grey Seer Thanquol stared in mute horror as the reservoir rushed from the ruptured wall, hurtling down into the chasm, rushing into the darkness. The cataract of water bore with it the wormstone powder, speeding its poisonous taint far from where it would wreak havoc upon the people of Altdorf. Even the traitors that were under Altdorf would be spared. Such a torrent would hardly stop at the pools and streams the Skaven used. It would rage onwards until it reached the sunken ocean beneath the world, far beyond the reach of men or dwarfs or goblins and even Skaven. It was not fair. Just as he has accomplished his victory, Thanquol had been cheated of his triumph. The glory and power, the authority and riches that the Lords of Decay would have showered upon him, all of it lost. Lost because of that heretic Skrulk and those traitors Burnfang and Nortail, Scarpaw and Cratch. Stolen from him by that damn meddling human mage thing. Thanquol saw the cloaked wizard rise weakly to his feet. Now it was Scrivener who was the weak one. The Grey Seer drew his sword, the foul rune engraved upon the black blade glowing evilly in the shadows. He wanted to test Thanquol's blade, did he? Well, the Grey Seer was going to show him how much courage there was in his spleen. Scrivener stared back at Thanquol as the Grey Seer stalked towards him. This time it was the wizard's turn to look at something just beyond his enemy. A hiss of laughter rasped from the Magister's muffled face. Thanquol spun about, his eyes narrowing with outrage as he saw the wizard's men rushing at him from the far side of the causeway. Having escaped across the now destroyed scaffold, they were returning, rushing to their master's aid. "Strike, coward meat," Scrivener jeered. "Or does Grey Seer Thanquol fear shiver me, because my warriors will avenge their master?" Thanquol snarled at Scrivener, but refused to rise to the wizard's bait. The Magister was trying to delay him, to keep him lingering about this place long enough for his man-things to get him. Thanquol had lost enough already. There was nothing to be gained risking his pelt further. The Grey Seer opened his scroll, his lips moving in a rapid stream of spits and squeaks. Abruptly, there was a crack like lightning and a stench of brimstone. A black cloud of smoke lazily swirled about the place where Thanquol had stood. Scrivener's men stared in amazement at the deathly cloud, stunned by the Grey Seer's sorcerous disappearance. The wizard himself simply shook his head sadly, wondering if perhaps the world might have been safer trading a Jeremiah Scrivener to remove a Grey Seer Thanquol. "We failed you, Master," Theodore apologized, taking Scrivener's arm and supporting the weakened Magister as he started back along the causeway. The wizard shook his head, pointing to the ruptured wall of the reservoir. Grimbold had worked on the Kaiserschwalbe. The dwarf had known the exact spot where a little explosive could do a lot of damage. The entire reservoir was draining away, taking with it the vile poison of the Skaven. There would be much hardship and suffering in Altdorf in the weeks and months to come. It might take years before the Kaiserschwalbe could be repaired, and in that time, the city would be forced to find other ways to satisfy its thirst. Water barons would grow rich, carting potable water into the capital. The poor would be reduced to boiling the polluted waters of the Reich. Unrest and disorder would follow upon such a crisis, politicians and nobles exploiting it towards their own needs, growing fat off the suffering of the masses. The authorities would be busy trying to maintain the peace, and with their attention diverted, many terrible things would be free to slink into Altdorf's dark streets and forgotten corners. Scrivener would have spared Altdorf its suffering, but Thankwall had left him no choice. To save the city from the horrible fate the Grey Seer had planned for it, the reservoir had to be broken. Failed? Scrivener asked Theodore. He pointed at the one section of reservoir wall that had resisted Grimbold's demolition. Like the outer surface, the inside of the wall had borne a fresco. Despite the build-up of algae and the ravages of time, the subject of the fresco was still intact, almost whole despite the destruction all around it. Theodore's mouth dropped as he recognized whose image it was depicted on the tiles. Magnus the Pious, the watchman gasped. Scrivener nodded his hooded head. Saviour of the Empire, he said, but to save it, he first had to destroy the corruption within it. That is the way of saviours. If they would succeed, they must know when they must play the part of the destroyer. Black smoke and green lightning swirled about Greyseal Thankwall as his body was thrust through the demon world of chaos. Every hair on the Ratman's pelt stood on end as he became a thing of substance and shape no more. Thankwall hated these terrifying retreats into the maddening realm beyond the spheres of order. Even though it had passed almost quicker than a single heartbeat, he could not shake the horror of even so brief a glimpse at planes of existence, alien and hostile to creatures of flesh and bone. It was a door that was opened only in moments of the most dire duress, and shut again as swiftly. Yet he could not help but feel the malevolent gaze of hungry eyes watching him as he blinked between worlds. Demon things that might, with the least effort, close the door before he had passed through it. The thought was horrible enough to make the Grey Seer's empty glands clench. He shivered at the idea of being trapped in that horrible void between the physical and the astral. His very soul nothing but a plaything for monsters of the ether, only companions, watching with eyes of malice and hate. Thankwall fell into a wary crouch, his staff held before him to ward off lurking foes. Eyes glittered at him from the darkness, bright yellow eyes wide with the most rapt attention. For an instant, he thought that some of those demon things had passed through the doorway with him when he used his spell to shatter the harmony of spheres. His paws scrambled beneath the folds of his robe for even the smallest pebble of warpstone he might have forgotten. Anything that might give him the power to fend off, or at least run away from, such ghastly foes. A familiar smell made Thankwall's terrified expression tighten into a sneer of annoyance and contempt. He knew that smell. The stink of the mangy felines man-things kept as pets. There must be dozens of the vile beasts all around him, filling the air with their reek. Now that the Grey Seer's eyes were completely adjusted to physical colours and a world where light and darkness existed as separate and disparate things, Thankor could see that he was in some man-thing's cellar. A dingy little brick-walled room filled to bursting with clutter. Old chairs, empty barrels, mouldy portraits of long-dead birthkin, the accumulated rubbish of several generations of garbage-collecting humans. Beneath, around, and on top of the clutter, a riotous array of cats were curled into little frightened balls of fur and eyes. Thankor hissed at the closest of the beasts, sending the flat-eared tabby scurrying backwards beneath a three-legged table, its frightened eyes never leaving the Grey Seer. It started yowling, a quivering sound quickly picked up by other cats scattered about the cellar. The Grey Seer scratched at his ears, deciding he'd never heard quite so abominable a sound. A voice called down from the room above the cellar. The soft, shrill sort of voice Thankor knew commonly indicated an older breeder among the humans, what the man-things called a woman. "Carl, Franz, Beatrice, my little babies, what's going on down there?" Thankor's eyes darted from side to side, scanning the rubbish for some new sign of foes. It took several breaths before he realised that the human was calling down to the menagerie of shabby cats. The Grey Seer ground his teeth together. After all he had suffered, all he had lost today, this was the final indignity. Jumping at a bunch of snivelling cats. "What is all that racket, babies?" the woman called down again. Thankor could hear a door open, a little sliver of light sliding down into the cellar. He could hear a step creak as someone started to descend. "What are you doing? Do you have a rat cornered down there?" Thankor's lips pulled back, exposing his sharp fangs. He'd worked up quite the appetite. What with all the fighting and leading and run tactical withdrawals, eating the stringy meat of a cat was one of the few things a Skaven found too revolting to contemplate. But an old human breeder? "Don't get too close to the old rat, babies," the woman cooed, her steps now rapid as she descended the stairwell. "He might bite you and make you sick, darlings." Grey Seer Thankor rolled his eyes. He hoped she was fat, at least. It was going to be a long trip back to Skaven Blight, and he needed something to nibble on along the way. "I have a broom, sweeties," the old woman called as she stepped down onto the floor. "I'll swat the old rat." Her words faded into a horrified gargle, her eyes rolling into the back of her head as she fainted dead away at sight of the ghastly creature standing at the foot of the stairs. Thankor watched impassively as the old woman's body crashed to the ground. He let a pleased hiss rasp through his fangs as he bent over her. She was one of the fattest, plumpest specimens he's seen in quite some time. In the long catalogue of things that had gone wrong today, Thankor was happy to steal any crumb from the horned rat's larder. At least he'd have a full belly when he made the trip to Skaven Blight. Perhaps by the time he got there, he'd have concocted a lie to tell the Lords of Decay. Perhaps he'd even think of one good enough to keep Seer Lord Critislick from blasting him into greasy paste. There you have it. That is the end of Grey Seer by C.L. Werner. I really hope you enjoyed that. That was the first audiobook I've ever read. So I hope you can forgive some of the amateur quality of the voices and the mistakes and things like that. I'm also really tight for time. That's one of the reasons I keep going through and not editing out mistakes. But I've really enjoyed that, and I'm looking forward to the next book, which will be even better. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your comments, and I really hope you enjoyed that. And I look forward to speaking to you all again very soon.